If you leave aside any talk of substitution, what about this sacrifice for sin? What does the execution of Jesus by Roman imperial authority have to do with the theological concept of sacrifice for sin? Hold that question. Think of two other ones. Around the year 1600, Shakespeare said in As You Like It, "This old world is 6,000 years old." Why did he think the world started around 4000 BCE, as we say? Why does the Bible seem to say, if you count up all its time, that it all began about 4000 BCE? In fact, in the middle of the, I think it was 1640s, the theologians on both sides of the Irish Sea, Ussher in Ireland and Lightfoot in England, were busy working out the exact day, time, and date of the creation. And they all came out around 6,000 years ago. Now, it's easy enough to laugh at that when we think of millions of years. Why did they come up with 4000 BCE? You know, if you're making it up, why not a nice round number like 10,000 or 20,000? Why 4? So hold that question. Why does the Bible seem to think something really important like creation started, from our point of view, 6,000 years ago? Here's a second question. When do you first find the word sin in the Bible? When is it first mentioned? No, it's not in the garden, by the way. When is it first mentioned? By whom? In what context? When is original sin first mentioned in the Bible? When is the first idea of sin mentioned? Let me start with that first question. What happened, if you're thinking about 6,000 years ago? From the biblical point of view, 4,000 years before the time, say, of Christ. What happened? Once you ask it that way, and don't simply say how silly to think that creation was only 6,000 years ago, the answer is immediately obvious. The Neolithic Revolution, see what that is in a second, the Neolithic Revolution climaxed on the plains of Mesopotamia around 4000 BCE. What's the Neolithic Revolution and why on the plains of Mesopotamia? What we are doing is inventing, and I mean inventing, irrigated farming. The end of nomadic life for many people, or some people at least, and irrigated farming. On the Great Plains of Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and the Euphrates River, and the same thing is going to be happening in the Nile and other great rivers, but I'm focusing on Mesopotamia because that's what the Bible knows about. On the plains of Mesopotamia, between the great alluvial rivers. By alluvial rivers, I mean they bring down annual floods, they lay out either side, the water expands, and minerals are laid down, and it happens every year. And if you could set up irrigated farming, in other words, you weren't just swamped by the floods, but you were ready for the flood to come down, and you had your irrigated lines laid out, you could have rich farmland. You could have farming. You could settle down. So instead of wandering with your herds and your flocks, you could settle down. You could domesticate grains, like barley, wheat. You could domesticate animals, cattle, sheep, goats. And you could domesticate people, because you're going to organize them for irrigation, and once they're organized for irrigation, they can be organized for all sorts of other things, including protection, war, imperialism. So on the plains of Mesopotamia, archetypally, not only there, but especially there, they invented irrigated farming, the Neolithic Revolution, and also known as civilization. That's why Mesopotamia is called the cradle of civilization. So 6,000 years ago, something profound happened. Settle down farming. Pick up my second question. When is sin first mentioned in the Bible? By whom, when, and all the rest of it? Go to Genesis chapter 4. Genesis chapter 4 is the most succinct summary of the Neolithic Revolution ever written. And I'm not talking metaphorically, I'm talking literally, because it is talking about the Neolithic Revolution. Remember the story. Cain kills Abel. Everyone pretty much knows that. Cain kills Abel. But the important thing, Cain is the farmer. Abel is the herder. That's emphasized. Cain is the farmer. He offers to God the grain, the gifts of his grain. Abel is the herder, and of course he offers to God the sheep as a sacrifice. And by the way, you notice that God seems to be on Abel's side. God's the great conservative. God knows what's going to happen. Cain kills Abel. The farmer kills the herder. Footnote. It's not quite like Oklahoma. Rodgers and Hammerstein's Oklahoma says, no, the farmer and the herder can't be friends. The farmer kills the herder. That's exactly the same story we find among the Sumerians, who were the first people who went through the Neolithic Revolution, thought about it, wrote about it, because they'd invented writing, and we have their thoughts. And among their thoughts are the farmer and the herder. Now, in the Mesopotamian story, they managed to remain friends by sharing the water. The story in the Bible is more accurate to history, of course. The farmer kills the herder. Once the farmer arrives, the day of the herder is really finished. It's over. The next thing in the same story, read the whole chapter. The next thing that Cain does is build the first city. Farmer kills herder, builds city. You can imagine it's a headline in the Sumerian Times around 6,000 years ago. That's the summary of the Neolithic Revolution. Farmer kills herder, farmer kills herder, builds city, and of course in the long history of the human race, the city is going to doom the farmer, as we all know. So this is their summary of the Neolithic Revolution. What has sin to do with this? God says to Cain, before the murder, sin is crouching at the door, waiting to pounce, but you can beat it. That's terribly important. It's the first mention of sin. It's not something that can't be controlled. It is something that Cain cannot do. So the first time sin is mentioned, it is about Cain killing Abel. So then the great inaugural sin is fratricide. No. That's not the point. Cain kills Abel. And then God says, if anyone kills Cain, there'll be sevenfold vengeance. And when we're reading carelessly, as we usually do when we read the Bible, we think that's God threatening, if anyone kills Cain, I'll take out sevenfold. Not at all. This is the blood feud, the desert blood feud, already starting, that says Cain kills Abel. That's 1 and 1. If anyone kills Cain, his tribe will exact sevenfold vengeance. This is the great blood feud. And when you get to the end of that chapter, Lamech is a few generations after, I've forgotten, 4 or 5 generations, after Cain. He says, I've already killed somebody for hitting me. I've killed somebody for hitting me. That's escalation. And if anyone kills me, Lamech, my tribe will exact 70 times vengeance. So we've escalated within this chapter from 1 and 1, 7 and 1, to 70 to 1. What we find is in chapter 4 of Genesis, sin is, my term now, hyphenated, escalatory violence. Not just violence, but escalatory violence. Violence escalates. We've got it all laid out for us in one chapter. And it warns us that sin is about violence. Now, sometimes when I've said this, I've got into arguments with people who say, oh, there's all sorts of other sins that don't involve violence. And I don't want to get into that argument. But the first time sin is mentioned in the Bible, mentioned by God, it's about escalatory violence that threatens God's world and God's people. So I'm taking that very seriously. For practical purposes, I'm going to equate sin and violence. Now, how has Jesus died for our sins if, when you're thinking about sin, you're thinking about violence? And by violence, I mean that which threatens the world and threatens the people of the world. Let me emphasize this for a minute. On the worst day of Roman slaughter, they didn't threaten to destroy the Mediterranean. You know, no Roman sword could cut down an olive tree. There wouldn't be much left of the sword by the time we were finished. But escalatory violence seems to be the destiny of the human race. We have escalated steadily. We've never had a weapon we didn't use. We've never invented a weapon that wasn't worse than the one that preceded it. So we're asking the very question whether our species has a future with escalatory violence. So for the moment, I'm quite willing to say, all right, as far as I'm concerned, I'm going to equate sin and escalatory violence. And when we solve that one, we can discuss what else. So Jesus, back to Jesus. Jesus lived a life of nonviolent resistance to evil. Don't think I'm simply taking Martin Luther King or Gandhi and putting him back in the first century. We did not invent nonviolent resistance. It was already an option in the first century. There was, of course, violent resistance to Rome in the first century. We know that, and that's all we talk about. But there are just as many examples of non-violent resistance, not just by individuals, but by organized individuals to violence in the first century. They invented it. We did not. So in talking about Jesus as non-violent resistance, I'm not saying at all, well, he invented something that none of his fellow Jews had ever imagined. No, not at all. He was simply taking something that was one of the options of his people and saying, we must practice nonviolent resistance because that's the way God is. So, Jesus lives a life of nonviolent resistance to evil, and what happens? He dies. He is executed. And he doesn't become violent. We've just saw at the end of our last session that that's the difference between Pilate and Jesus. So Jesus dies as a witness against our sin of violence, as a gift to God and a gift from God of the non-violent life of resistance to evil. That this is our destiny as a human species. Jesus died from our sins, because violence is the normal way we run our lives. And he died for our sins, not as substitution. It has nothing to do with substitution. He dies for our sins to witness to us that violence will destroy us, that our species will not be able to survive if violence keeps escalating. Let me end with an example. We need the term sacrifice. Don't give it up. Don't think just because substitution is there that you can abandon sacrifice. In ordinary human life, every day we need it. Monday, January the 13th, 1982. Air Florida 90 lifted off from Washington National Airport. Inadequately de-iced and inadequately piloted. It barely got airborne before it crashed into the icy Potomac off the 14th Street Bridge. When it went down, only six people survived the first impact and managed to climb onto the tail, which was sticking up out of the icy waters. It took a while for the rescue helicopter to come. It was terribly dangerous, as you might imagine. First of all, the rotor effects was shaking everything, and of course it was very dangerous for the pilot, who was almost down at water level, but they finally started to drop lines. Arland Williams Jr. was the first person. Before his name was known, he was called the sixth passenger. He caught the line and he passed it to the stewardess who was next to him, who was badly hurt. She was pulled to safety. And it moved down the line. Every time the line came down, he passed it on. Line down, passed it on. Until by the time the last person was pulled to safety, he sort of just drifted into the waters with hypothermia. He was actually the only person drowned that day. Everyone else was killed on impact or saved. Now, I don't know what term was used for that. But if the Washington Post said, man dies or man drowns, no. Man sacrifices his life. He gave up his life for others. For that we need the word sacrifice, and that's the word appropriate for the death of Jesus also.